A woman on the run from a life she never chose. A man torn between two worlds. When their paths cross on the desolate Dakota plains, neither imagines how one moment of trust will ignite a chain of danger, passion, and survival. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The dust swirled across the Dakota Territory as Thomas Lakota adjusted his worn leather hat against the harsh summer sun. The year was 1878, and the small settlement of Willow Creek was barely a speck on the vast prairie landscape. Thomas, a half Lakota, half-white rancher, had built a modest homestead on the outskirts of town, far enough to avoid the suspicious glares of townspeople but close enough to trade when necessary. "Ain't gonna be much of a harvest if this drought keeps up," he muttered to himself, surveying the parched fields from atop his chestnut mare. At 32, Thomas had grown accustomed to the solitude that came with being caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The distant sound of wagon wheels caught his attention. Travelers were uncommon on this isolated stretch, especially in the punishing heat of August. Thomas squinted against the sun, making out a single wagon approaching, moving at an unsteady pace. "Something ain't right," he said to his horse, nudging her forward. As he drew closer, he could see the wagon was in poor condition, one wheel wobbling dangerously. The driver, a young woman dressed in a once fine but now dusty and torn dress, was struggling to control the team of exhausted horses. Just as Thomas reached the crest of the hill, the wheel gave way completely, sending the wagon lurching to one side. The woman let out a startled cry as she was thrown from her seat. "Whoa there!" Thomas called, spurring his horse forward. He reached the scene just as the woman was picking herself up, brushing dirt from her skirts with shaking hands. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" Thomas asked, dismounting and approaching cautiously, aware that his appearance often frightened strangers. The woman looked up, revealing a face streaked with dust and tears. Despite this, Thomas could see she was strikingly beautiful, with clear blue eyes that widened slightly at the sight of him. I'm all right," she replied, her voice carrying the refined tones of Eastern education. "Just a bit shaken." "Name's Thomas Lakota," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "My place is just over that ridge. I can help fix your wagon, but it'll take time." The woman hesitated, clearly weighing her limited options in the middle of nowhere. "I'm Eleanor Blackwood," she finally said. "From Boston. I was traveling to Fort Pierre to meet my fiancé." Thomas noted her hesitation. Quite a journey for a lady alone. "I had no choice," she replied, glancing nervously over her shoulder at the eastern horizon. "I simply couldn't wait for an escort." Thomas recognized the look of someone running from something, or someone. He'd worn that same expression himself years ago. "Well, Miss Blackwood, that wheel won't fix itself and night comes quick out here. Predators, too." He gestured to the darkening sky. "I offer you shelter for the night. We can salvage what we can from your wagon and repair it tomorrow." Eleanor straightened her shoulders, attempting to regain her composure. "Mr. Lakota, I appreciate your offer, but I don't know you. I can't simply—" A distant howl cut through the air, followed by another. "Wolves. Those are getting closer," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "And your horses are spent. Decision's yours, Miss Blackwood, but I wouldn't recommend spending the night out here alone." Eleanor looked at her broken wagon, then back at Thomas. Despite his intimidating appearance, there was something in his eyes she found herself trusting. "I have no money to offer you," she admitted quietly. Thomas shook his head, "Not asking for any. Out here, we help when help's needed. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure the rest out." As they worked to unhitch the horses and salvage her few belongings, Thomas noticed a small leather-bound journal Eleanor clutched tightly, never letting it out of her sight, even as she struggled with heavier items. "Must be important," Thomas commented, nodding toward the book. Eleanor quickly tucked it into her pocket. "It's nothing, just memories." "We all got those," Thomas replied, securing her trunk to his horse. "Some worth keeping, some best left behind." As they made their way to his homestead in the fading light, Eleanor couldn't help but glance back repeatedly, as though expecting to see someone following their trail. "Whoever you're running from," Thomas said quietly, "they won't find you tonight." Eleanor turned to him, startled. "I'm not what you believe," she whispered. "My story." It's complicated. Thomas nodded, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. Out here, most stories are. The morning light filtered through the worn cotton curtains of Thomas's spare room, where Eleanor had spent a restless night. The bed, though simple, was the first real comfort she'd experienced in the 2 weeks since fleeing Boston. She sat up, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of prairie life, chickens clucking, the distant lowing of cattle, and the rhythmic chopping of wood that told her Thomas was already at work. Eleanor reached for her journal, hidden beneath her pillow during the night. Opening it carefully, she reread the last entry, written by candlelight the previous evening while Thomas prepared a simple but hearty stew for their dinner. I fear James has sent men after me. The telegram operator in Sioux Falls looked at me strangely. Does he have descriptions circulated? How far does his influence reach? I cannot return. I would rather die on these plains than go back to that life of elegant imprisonment. A knock at the door startled her. She quickly closed the journal and tucked it into her dress pocket. "Miss Blackwood, there's coffee and breakfast when you're ready." Thomas called through the door, his deep voice oddly comforting in its directness. "Thank you. I'll be right there," she replied, quickly pinning up her hair and straightening her rumpled dress as best she could. In the main room of the modest cabin, Thomas had set out a simple breakfast of cornbread, bacon, and strong black coffee. He was seated at the table, studying what appeared to be a broken piece from her wagon wheel. "Wood's rotted through," he said without preamble. "Whoever sold you this wagon cheated you badly." Eleanor sighed, taking the seat across from him. "I had limited options and even more limited time. The man knew I was desperate." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Been there myself. But this wheel can't be fixed. I'll need to make a new one." "How long will that take?" Eleanor asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. "Few days, maybe more. I got work to do around here too." Eleanor set down her coffee cup with determination. "I can work, Mr. Lakota. I won't be a burden while I'm here." Thomas raised an eyebrow, taking in her delicate hands, clearly unused to manual labor. "Can you cook? Mend clothes?" "I can learn," she insisted. "I'm not afraid of hard work." A hint of a smile crossed Thomas's usually stoic face. "All right then. We'll start after breakfast." The days that followed established a routine between them. Thomas showed Eleanor how to tend the kitchen garden, collect eggs from the ornery hens, and prepare simple meals. She proved a quick study, determined to pull her weight despite her occasional mistakes. In the evenings they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Gradually, Eleanor began to share pieces of her story. "I was to be married to James Harrington," she explained on the third night, her fingers nervously tracing the spine of her journal. "A business arrangement more than a match. My father's shipping company was failing, and James offered to save it in exchange for my hand." Thomas listened silently, whittling a piece of wood as she spoke. "At first I accepted my duty, but then I discovered James's true nature, controlling, cruel behind closed doors, and his business practices." She shuddered. "He's not above using violence to eliminate competition. When I confronted him, he locked me in my room, said the wedding would proceed as planned." She looked up at Thomas, her eyes hard with resolve. "So I climbed out the window and ran, took what little money I had saved and fled west." "And the journal?" Thomas asked quietly. Eleanor's hand instinctively covered her pocket. "Evidence. Records of his dealings that I managed to copy. If he finds me..." She trailed off. "He won't," Thomas said firmly, surprising himself with the protectiveness he felt toward this woman he barely knew. The next morning brought unexpected trouble. Thomas had ridden to a neighbor's farm to borrow tools for the wheel repair, leaving Eleanor to tend to the morning chores. She was hanging laundry when the sound of approaching horses broke the morning quiet. 2 riders appeared on the horizon, heading directly for the homestead. Eleanor dropped the wet sheet she was holding and ran for the cabin, her heart pounding. She grabbed Thomas's old rifle from above the door, though she had no idea how to use it, and positioned herself by the window. As the riders drew closer, she could see they weren't the well-dressed agents she feared James might have sent. Instead, they were rough-looking men, locals by their appearance, and clearly surprised to see laundry hanging in Thomas Lakota's yard. "Hello, the house," one called, stopping his horse at a respectful distance. "Looking for Lakota." "He's not here," Eleanor called back, keeping the rifle visible but pointed down. The men exchanged glances. "And who might you be, ma'am?" the second man asked, suspicion evident in his tone. "A traveler with a broken wagon. Mr. Lakota has kindly offered assistance." She kept her voice steady, chin raised. "That so?" The first man spat tobacco juice on the ground. "Interesting company Lakota's keeping these days. When he gets back, tell him Sheriff Adams is looking for him. There's been cattle gone missing from the Henderson place." Eleanor's grip tightened on the rifle. "Are you accusing Mr. Lakota of something?" The second man shrugged. "Just passing along a message, ma'am. But you might want to be careful about the company you keep out here. Lakota's got mixed blood and a mixed reputation." "Thank you for your concern," Eleanor replied coldly. "I'll deliver your message." She watched as they rode away, not lowering the rifle until they disappeared over the horizon. Only then did her hands begin to shake, the full weight of her isolation hitting her. Here she was, hundreds of miles from home, depending on the kindness of a man she barely knew, a man others clearly viewed with suspicion. When Thomas returned hours later, she told him about the visitors. "Henderson's been trying to push me off this land for years," Thomas explained, his jaw tight with anger. "Accusing me of stealing his cattle is just his latest attempt." "Will the sheriff believe him?" Eleanor asked. Thomas shrugged. "Sheriff Adams is fair enough, but in these parts, a white man's word often carries more weight than mine." Eleanor studied his face, seeing for the first time the burden he carried every day, the constant need to prove himself, to be beyond reproach in a world determined to think the worst of him. "I understand more than you might think," she said softly. "Being judged for what people believe you are rather than who you actually are." Their eyes met in a moment of perfect understanding, and something shifted between them, a recognition of kindred spirits despite their vastly different backgrounds. "I believe you," Thomas said simply, those 3 words carrying more weight than any elaborate declaration could have. That night, Eleanor wrote in her journal, "I came west seeking escape, but perhaps I've found something I never expected. Someone who sees me for who I truly am." A week turned into 2 as Thomas worked on the wagon wheel between his regular chores. Eleanor had settled into life at the homestead with surprising ease, her city-bred hands growing calloused from work, her pale skin taking on a sun-kissed glow. The simple blue dress Thomas had found in a trunk, left behind by his late mother, fit her well enough after some alterations, replacing her impractical Boston finery. "You're a natural with those chickens," Thomas commented one morning as Eleanor scattered feed in the coop. "They hated me for months when I first got them." Eleanor laughed, a sound that had become increasingly common. "Animals sense fear. You were probably too cautious with them." "Maybe so," Thomas agreed, leaning against the fence post. "The wheel's nearly done, another day or 2. Eleanor's smile faltered slightly. "That's good news." Neither mentioned what would happen when the wagon was repaired. The original plan, Eleanor continuing to Fort Pierre to board a riverboat heading further west, hung unspoken between them. That afternoon, Thomas rode into town for supplies, leaving Eleanor to prepare dinner. He'd been reluctant to go, worried about leaving her alone after the visit from the sheriff's men, but they needed flour and coffee. The general store in Willow Creek was run by Harold Jenkins, one of the few townspeople who treated Thomas fairly, primarily because Thomas had once saved his son from drowning in the creek that gave the town its name. "Afternoon, Thomas," Harold greeted him. "Ain't seen you in a spell." "Been busy," Thomas replied, placing his list on the counter. Harold began gathering the items. "Heard you got yourself some company out at your place. Eastern lady with a broken wagon?" Thomas stiffened. "News travels fast." "Small town." Harold shrugged. "Sheriff's boys been running their mouths. Henderson's still pushing that cattle-rustling nonsense." "Henderson knows damn well I haven't touched his stock," Thomas growled. Harold lowered his voice. "There's something else you should know. Had a fancy fella in here 2 days ago. City clothes, city manners, asking questions about a young woman traveling alone. Showed a photograph around." Thomas's hand froze on the counter. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing to tell. Said I hadn't seen any lone women passing through." Harold paused. But Pierce over at the livery might not have been so tight-lipped. He could use the reward money being offered. Reward? Thomas asked, his mouth suddenly dry. Harold nodded grimly. $500 for information leading to the safe return of Miss Eleanor Blackwood to her concerned fiancé. That's a fortune around these parts. Thomas quickly paid for his supplies, his mind racing. I appreciate the warning, Harold. Whatever trouble that girl's in, Thomas, be careful it don't become yours too. Harold bagged the last of the items. Henderson and his friends would love an excuse to run you off your land for good. Thomas rode home at a gallop, dust billowing behind him. He found Eleanor hanging the last of the laundry, humming softly to herself. We need to talk, he said without dismounting, his tone urgent enough that Eleanor immediately dropped the sheet she was holding. Inside the cabin, Thomas explained what he'd learned in town. Eleanor sank into a chair, her face pale. It's James. He must have followed my trail. Her hands trembled as she reached for her journal. I knew he wouldn't give up easily. Not with what I know. What exactly is in there? Thomas asked, nodding toward the journal. Eleanor hesitated, then handed it to him. See for yourself. Thomas flipped through pages of neat handwriting, detailed accounts of business transactions, names, dates, and amounts. I don't understand all this. James has been working with officials to seize land from Indian tribes, then selling it to the railroad at enormous profit, Eleanor explained. He's bribed government agents, threatened those who wouldn't cooperate, even arranged accidents for those who stood in his way. Thomas's expression hardened as he continued reading. These are my people's lands you're writing about. Yes, Eleanor whispered. When I discovered what he was doing, I couldn't be part of it. I couldn't marry a man who would destroy lives for profit. Thomas closed the journal, his face unreadable. And now he's here, looking for you in this evidence. I need to leave, Eleanor said, standing abruptly. I've put you in danger. If James discovers I'm here, he won't hesitate to hurt you or destroy your home. The wheel isn't finished, Thomas argued. And even if it was, where would you go? If he's traced you this far, he'll find you in Fort Pierre, too. I don't know, Eleanor admitted, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. I just know I can't stay here and risk bringing his vengeance down on you. Thomas stood, moving closer to her. Eleanor, listen to me. Running alone isn't the answer. We need to think this through. We? She questioned, looking up at him. Yes, we, Thomas affirmed, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Your fight became my fight the moment you showed me what's in that journal. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about my people's land, about justice. Eleanor searched his face. Why would you risk everything for me? You barely know me. Thomas was silent for a long moment. Maybe I know enough, he finally said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. The tension between them shifted, the air suddenly charged with unspoken feelings that had been growing during their weeks together. Eleanor swayed slightly toward him, and Thomas's hand moved as if to touch her face. A gunshot shattered the moment, the bullet splintering the window frame inches from Thomas's head. Get down, Thomas shouted, pulling Eleanor to the floor as more shots peppered the cabin. He crawled to his rifle and returned fire through the broken window. How many? Eleanor gasped, pressing herself against the floor. Can't tell. At least 3, maybe more. Thomas fired again, then ducked as a bullet embedded itself in the wall behind him. It's Henderson, he growled. Must have decided to take matters into his own hands. Or James found me and hired local help, Eleanor suggested, her voice shaking. Outside, a man's voice called out, Lakota! Send the woman out and maybe we won't burn you out. Thomas and Eleanor exchanged glances. That answers that question, Thomas muttered. What do we do? Eleanor whispered. Thomas checked his ammunition. There's a cellar trapdoor under the rug. My father built it as a hiding place during raids. Get down there, take the journal. I'm not leaving you to face them alone. You're no good with a gun and I can move faster alone, Thomas argued. If something happens to me, wait until dark, then take my horse and ride west to the Standing Rock Reservation. Ask for Joseph Black Elk. He was my father's friend. He'll help you. Another volley of bullets hit the cabin, one passing through the opposite window in a spray of glass. Thomas, please, Eleanor begged, grabbing his arm. Come with me. For a heartbeat, their eyes locked. Then Thomas leaned forward and kissed her, brief but fierce. "Get in the cellar. That's not a request." Eleanor reluctantly obeyed, clutching her journal as Thomas helped her through the trap door. "Stay quiet no matter what you hear," he instructed, then closed the door, sliding the heavy rug back into place. In the darkness of the cellar, Eleanor pressed her ear to the wooden ceiling, listening to Thomas's boots move across the floor above, the occasional report of his rifle answering the attacker's shots. She had never felt so helpless, so responsible for bringing danger to someone who had shown her nothing but kindness. Above, she heard a crash as something heavy hit the front door. Thomas fired again. Then came a sound that made her blood run cold, the distinctive whoosh of flames catching. They were setting fire to the cabin. Eleanor clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Smoke began to seep through the cracks in the floorboards as the attack continued. She heard Thomas coughing, still firing occasionally but moving frantically around the cabin, presumably trying to put out the flames. Then came a sound that would haunt her nightmares. Thomas crying out in pain, followed by a heavy thud directly above the trapdoor. Eleanor froze, tears streaming down her face as she listened desperately for any sign that he was still fighting, still alive. The gunfire stopped. Boots stomped across the floor, voices calling to one another as the fire spread. "Find the girl and the journal," ordered a cultured voice that Eleanor recognized with a chill of terror. James Harrington had found her. "Place is going up fast," another voice warned. "If she's in here, we need to find her now." "Search everywhere," James commanded. "She has to be here somewhere." Eleanor held her breath as footsteps moved across the floor directly above her. The smoke was getting thicker now, filling the small cellar space. She heard furniture being overturned, curses as the men found nothing. "Boss, we gotta go," someone shouted. "Roof's about to cave." "Not without what I came for," James raged. A loud crack from above made Eleanor flinch. Part of the roof must have collapsed. The footsteps retreated hastily, accompanied by more shouting. "Fall back, building's lost." Through her tears and the thickening smoke, Eleanor realized she faced an impossible choice: remain hidden and likely suffocate or burn to death, or reveal herself and face James's wrath. But what of Thomas? If he was still alive, she couldn't leave him to die. With shaking hands, Eleanor pushed against the trapdoor, finding it partially blocked by something heavy. Thomas's body, she pushed harder, managing to create a gap just wide enough to squeeze through. The cabin was an inferno, flames licking up the walls and across the ceiling. Through the smoke, she could make out Thomas's still form on the floor nearby, blood staining his shirt. "Thomas!" she cried, crawling to his side. He was breathing but unconscious, a bullet wound in his shoulder. Outside, she could hear James and his men regrouping, preparing to search the surrounding area. There was no escape through the doors or windows, all now engulfed in flames. The cellar. It was their only chance. With strength born of desperation, Eleanor began dragging Thomas's limp form toward the trapdoor, praying they could both fit in the small space and that the fire wouldn't find them there. Darkness, suffocating heat, the smell of smoke and blood. These sensations surrounded Eleanor as she huddled in the cramped cellar, cradling Thomas's head in her lap. She had managed to drag him down before the cabin collapsed above them, the heavy beams creating a barrier that miraculously protected the trap door from the worst of the fire. Hours had passed, or perhaps minutes. Time lost meaning in their underground refuge. Eleanor had torn strips from her petticoat to bandage Thomas's shoulder, pressing firmly against the wound to stem the bleeding. His breathing was labored but steady, giving her hope. "Thomas," she whispered, brushing dirt and sweat from his face. "Please wake up, I can't do this alone." Whether it was her voice or the pain that roused him, Thomas's eyes finally fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition. "Eleanor?" he croaked, voice rough from smoke. "The cabin, gone," she confirmed softly. "James and his men set it on fire. They're looking for me. For us." Thomas struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement jarred his injured shoulder. "How long was I out?" "Hours. It's night now, I think. The fire has died down, but I can still hear them searching." Indeed, faint voices occasionally drifted down to them, along with the sounds of boots crunching through the charred remains of Thomas's home. James had not given up. "We can't stay here," Thomas muttered, pain evident in every word. "No water, no food, and this wound needs proper tending." Eleanor bit her lip. "But if we leave, we'll need to be smart about it." Thomas reached for her hand in the darkness, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "Listen to me carefully. There's a creek about half a mile behind the property. If we can reach it, we can follow it downstream to where it meets the river. My friend Joseph, the one I told you about, has a camp near there." "You're in no condition to walk half a mile," Eleanor protested. "No choice," Thomas replied grimly. "Wait until it's fully dark. Then we go." They sat in tense silence, listening as the searchers' voices grew more frustrated and distant. James was directing them to widen the search perimeter, convinced that Eleanor must have fled before the fire. When the voices had faded enough, Thomas pushed against the trapdoor. It didn't budge. "Debris from the cabin," he grunted. "We'll both need to push." Eleanor positioned herself beside him, and together they strained against the wooden door. Slowly, painfully, it began to give way, showering them with ash and dirt as they created an opening barely wide enough to squeeze through. The night air, though tainted with smoke, felt like heaven after hours in the stifling cellar. The full moon illuminated the devastating scene. Thomas's home reduced to smoldering ruins, his fields trampled, livestock scattered or stolen. In the distance, lanterns bobbed as James's search party combed the prairie. "Stay low," Thomas whispered, his face ashen with pain and grief. "Follow me." They crept through the shadows, using the burned cabin as cover, before making a dash for a small stand of trees that marked the path to the creek. Thomas stumbled once, nearly falling as his wounded body protested the exertion. Eleanor caught him, supporting his weight as best she could. "Almost there," she encouraged, though the creek seemed impossibly far away. A shout from behind froze them in place. One of the searchers had spotted movement. "Run," Thomas urged, pushing Eleanor ahead. "Don't stop, don't look back." "Not without you," she insisted, pulling his good arm across her shoulders. Together they staggered forward as their pursuers closed the distance. The crack of a rifle split the night, the bullet kicking up dirt at their feet. "There!" James's voice carried across the darkness. "I want her alive!" They reached the creek just as more shots rang out. Thomas pushed Eleanor down the bank, following with less grace as his legs gave way. They splashed into the shallow water, the cold shock momentarily reviving Thomas's failing strength. "Downstream," he gasped. "The current will hide our trail." They waded through the water, each step a battle against exhaustion and fear. Behind them, voices and lanterns approached the creek bank. "Spread out!" They went into the water. Eleanor's sodden skirts dragged her down, threatening to sweep her off her feet in the swifter sections. Thomas's strength was clearly waning, his movements growing more uncoordinated as blood loss and exertion took their toll. "There's a bend ahead," he panted. "Behind it, a cave in the bank. My father showed me when I was a boy." The cave was little more than an indentation in the muddy bank, partially hidden by overhanging roots and brush. But it was enough. They crawled inside just as lantern light spilled around the bend. Eleanor pulled Thomas deeper into the darkness, covering his mouth with her hand as their pursuers splashed by. "They must have gone further downstream," one man called. "Keep moving." They remained motionless until the sounds of pursuit faded. Only then did Eleanor feel the full weight of Thomas slump against her. "Thomas," she whispered urgently. "Thomas, stay with me." His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. The bandage on his shoulder was soaked through with fresh blood, the exertion having reopened the wound. "Need to rest," he murmured. "Just a little while." "No, no," Eleanor urged, panic rising in her throat. "You have to stay awake. We need to keep moving." With desperate energy, she tore more strips from her already ragged dress, binding his shoulder tighter. Then she slapped his face lightly, forcing his eyes to open. "Thomas Lakota, I did not drag you into that cellar and out again just to lose you now," she said fiercely. "You will get up, and we will find Joseph's camp, and you will live. Do you understand me?" A faint smile touched his lips. "Yes, ma'am." Using the last of their combined strength, they continued downstream, moving more slowly now, but with grim determination. The creek widened, its waters growing deeper and more swift as smaller tributaries joined it. "There," Thomas pointed weakly as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Smoke. Through the morning mist rising off the water, Eleanor could just make out thin wisps of smoke rising from what appeared to be a small encampment near where the creek joined a wider river. Several hide-covered lodges stood in a semicircle, with a few figures moving about an early morning fire. Joseph's summer camp, Thomas confirmed. We made it. As they stumbled toward the camp, their appearance, bloody, muddy, exhausted, caused an immediate stir. A tall man with graying braids approached quickly, recognition and alarm crossing his weathered face as he identified Thomas. "How, Cola?" Joseph Black Elk greeted, quickly supporting Thomas's other side. "What has happened?" "Henderson," Thomas managed, "and others, burned my place, looking for her." He nodded toward Eleanor. Joseph barked orders in Lakota, and several women hurried to help, leading them to one of the lodges. Inside, they laid Thomas on a bed of furs while one of the women, Joseph's wife, Eleanor learned, examined his wound with practiced hands. "You safe now," Joseph assured Eleanor, handing her a cup of water. "Rest." But rest wouldn't come. Even as Thomas was tended to, fever setting in as infection took hold of his wound, Eleanor remained vigilant. She explained their situation to Joseph, showing him the journal with its damning evidence. "This man, this Harrington," Joseph said gravely after hearing her story. "He will not stop." "No," Eleanor agreed. "Not while I have this." She held up the journal. "And not while I live to testify to what I've seen." Joseph considered this, his dark eyes unreadable. Then perhaps it is time he faced justice of a different kind. Over the next 2 days, as Thomas fought his fever, Joseph sent riders to neighboring Lakota camps and to trusted allies among the white settlers. Word spread quietly about James Harrington's activities, about the evidence Eleanor carried, and about the attack on Thomas Lakota's homestead. On the 3rd day, as Thomas finally turned the corner toward recovery, a rider brought news. The territorial marshal had arrived in Willow Creek, investigating reports of land fraud and corruption. "This is our chance," Eleanor told Thomas, who was sitting up for the first time, pale but clear-eyed. "If we can get this evidence to the marshal—" "It's too dangerous," Thomas interrupted. "Harrington's still out there searching, which is why I must go alone," Eleanor insisted. "They're looking for both of us together. A single woman might pass unnoticed." "Absolutely not," Thomas began, but Joseph raised a hand. "She will not go alone," the older man said. "I have arranged an escort. My son and 3 warriors. They will see her safely to the marshal." Thomas looked between them, clearly unhappy but unable to argue against the logic. "I should be with you," he said to Eleanor, taking her hand. "You will be," she replied softly, placing her other hand over his heart. "And I'll return to you. I promise." The journey to Willow Creek was tense but uneventful. Joseph's son, a stern-faced young man named Daniel who had been educated at a government school, proved an articulate and imposing escort. They avoided the main roads, approaching the town from an unexpected direction. The territorial marshal, a no-nonsense former Union officer named Maxwell Grant, listened to Eleanor's story with increasing disbelief and anger, examining the journal's meticulous records with a practiced eye. "This is enough to hang a dozen men," he declared finally, "including your Mr. Harrington." "He's not my anything," Eleanor corrected firmly. Marshal Grant smiled slightly. "So I gather. Well, Miss Blackwood, you've shown remarkable courage. I'll need you to make a formal statement, but first," he stood, buckling on his gun belt, "I believe we should locate Mr. Harrington before he causes any more trouble." They found James at the town's only hotel, planning his next search sweep with Henderson and the hired men. The look of stunned disbelief on his face when Eleanor walked into the room flanked by the marshal and 2 deputies would stay with her forever. "Hello, James," she said calmly. "I believe you've been looking for me." "Eleanor," he managed, quickly composing his features into a concerned smile. "Thank God you're safe. I've been so worried." "Save it," Marshal Grant interrupted. "James Harrington, you're under arrest for fraud, corruption, conspiracy against the United States government, attempted murder, and arson." He nodded to his deputies. "Take him." James's facade cracked as the deputies approached. "You stupid woman," he snarled at Eleanor. "Do you have any idea who I am, who my associates are? This will never stick. I'll be free within a week." "Perhaps," Eleanor acknowledged, holding up her journal. But your reputation and your schemes won't survive the publication of this evidence. Every newspaper from here to Washington will run the story. As James was led away in handcuffs, still shouting threats, Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't over. There would be trials and testimonies ahead, but the immediate danger had passed. True to her word, Eleanor returned to Joseph's camp that same day, bringing not only news of James's arrest, but also papers from the marshal. "What's this?" Thomas asked, still confined to his bed but improving daily. "Legal documents," Eleanor explained, unfolding the papers. "Marshal Grant has officially recorded your homestead claim and added a neighboring parcel as compensation for the destruction of your property." Thomas stared at the papers. "Why would he do that?" "Because I told him how you helped me at great personal risk," Eleanor replied. "And because the evidence against Henderson was in my journal too. He won't be troubling you again." Thomas set the papers aside, looking up at her with an expression that made her heart race. "And what about you? What will you do now?" Eleanor sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "That depends," she said softly. "On what?" "On whether there might be a place for me here," she answered, vulnerability clear in her eyes. "With you." Thomas's hand tightened around hers. "I have no home to offer you," he reminded her. "Just a burned-out piece of land." "I don't need a house," Eleanor said. "I've had fine houses that were never homes." She leaned closer. "I need someone who sees me for who I truly am, who stood by me when everyone else would have turned away." Thomas reached up, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "I'm not what most women would choose," he said, echoing her words from their first meeting. "My life is hard, and people will talk." "Let them," Eleanor interrupted. "I'm not what you believed when you first saw me, either. But you took me in anyway." A smile, rare and beautiful, spread across Thomas's face. "Yes," he said simply. "I did." 3 months later, as the first snow dusted the newly rebuilt cabin on Thomas's land, Eleanor stood on the porch, watching her husband chop wood for the stove. The territorial court had convicted James Harrington and his co-conspirators, with Eleanor's testimony and journal providing the key evidence. The scandal had reached all the way to Washington, resulting in reforms to the Indian Affairs Office and new protections for reservation lands. Joseph and his family had helped them rebuild, creating a home larger and sturdier than the original. Eleanor's father, shocked by the news of Harrington's crimes and relieved to discover his daughter alive and well, had sent a generous wedding gift that allowed them to purchase more cattle and supplies for the winter. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, setting down his axe and joining her on the porch. Eleanor smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I was thinking about that first day when my wheel broke and you found me on the road. Best broken wheel that ever happened," he murmured against her hair. "Do you remember what I said to you? I'm not what you believe." Thomas turned her to face him, his dark eyes warm with love. "And I took you anyway," he finished. "Best decision I ever made." As snow continued to fall softly around them, Eleanor stood on tiptoe to kiss her husband, grateful for broken wheels, hidden cellars, and the courage to start anew on the wild Dakota plains.